At birth, a caterpillar gets one simple assignment: no meat under any circumstances. Just gorge on leaves, sit on a branch, and wait for the process that turns you into a butterfly to kick off. Mission accomplished. Get reborn as a caterpillar and repeat the loop forever. No meat. And why would a caterpillar even need meat if leaves are everywhere? Food's basically all around. You can just land on a plant and start eating immediately. But larva grows fast, and every extra half an inch of body demands protein and nitrogen. Leaves often give you bulk, but not much building material. So sure, you can eat a ton, but you still grow slowly. And what does that mean? It's more profitable to get the protein immediately, even if you have to take a risk to do it. And in some species, predatory behavior really does show up, mostly on islands. But why do these shifts pop up there more often than in ordinary mainland forests? And after switching to meat, what do those caterpillars ultimately turn into? An island is a system with hard limits. There are fewer species, food webs are shorter, and familiar food sources can be seasonal or unreliable. But if you want to survive, you've got to adapt. Because if you depend on a specific plant, one bad season and you're done. Small insects, on the other hand, show up in waves and often cluster in one spot, especially around a few dominant plants. In Hawaii, scientists described an entire group of caterpillars that turned predation from a rare fluke into a normal island lifestyle. Okay, but here's the problem. How can a caterpillar hunt at all if it's not fast and doesn't have weapons like predatory beetles do? I'll catch you, and I'll eat you. How long has it been like this? Day 2. If you can't chase your prey down, you have to make the prey come to you. That's why caterpillar predation rarely looks like a pursuit. It's built around ambush and a short, well-timed lunge. Here's the real mechanism. Some species sit perfectly still on the edge of a leaf or on a twig and react to touch. The attack triggers the moment an insect brushes against their body. So it's not a sprinter hunter, but a living trap. Minimal movement, maximum chance of grabbing whatever wandered too close. Basically like leopards, just without the spots. Same thing. But why would a caterpillar need workarounds if there are plenty of plants around? Because plenty doesn't mean suitable. Many leaves are either tough and low in nutrients or chemically defended, that is, edible but bad for growth. And if a larva needs to pack on mass fast, it starts looking for food where the right nutrients are already collected and prepackaged. And this is where it often ends up, not in hunting big prey, but in going after the easy stuff. Aphids and scale insects that sit in colonies and barely put up a fight. The caterpillars get animal protein without having to brawl, and they stay close to the plants. But then another question comes up. If caterpillars become carnivorous, why don't they keep evolving into full-blown killing machines? Predatory butterflies? I'd pay to see that. The logic is pretty simple. A caterpillar has a different job. It's a phase designed to convert food into body mass as efficiently as possible, not to burn energy on constant hunting and fighting. Predation here isn't a career change, it's a growth hack, a way to get key nutrients faster and with less effort. Meat's just a side gig. My main hustle is the leaf business. That's why these larvae tend to stick to a spot where food is reliably available instead of roaming around in active pursuit. In short, when a caterpillar eats meat, it's usually a targeted tactic. Ambushes, feeding in colonies of small insects, sometimes even cannibalism. Not a transformation into an all-purpose hunter. But how does a caterpillar even know it has prey in front of it if it doesn't have a predator's eyes and no time to aim? In this kind of hunting, vision isn't what matters. What matters is a signal that's hard to mistake, touch and vibration. If the prey actually bumps into the caterpillar's body or stirs the ground nearby, that's more reliable than trying to recognize shapes. That's why ambush caterpillars often attack on reflex. Something alive got too close, grab it. And that's the practical beauty of it. It saves energy and reduces mistakes. The whole strategy hangs on one short, explosive movement. Oh, come on, third time this week. But then something odd happened. Some carnivorous caterpillars that feed on other insects started hanging around ants. And ants are not the kind of neighbors you want to mess with, so why do that? If a larva feeds on aphids or mealybugs, it ends up in the same place the ants do automatically, because ants farm those insects for their sweet secretions. It's not a random encounter, it's a shared resource. For a typical caterpillar, that kind of proximity is dangerous, but for some it becomes part of the plan. Near ants, there are fewer outside predators and parasitoids. The ants aggressively guard their farm, so you get this paradoxical protection. You live inside a high security zone because it's actually better to risk dealing with ants than to be left without cover. Okay, but if ants are guarding aphids, why would they tolerate a caterpillar hanging around nearby at all? Ants don't make friends out of kindness. They put up only with what doesn't threaten their resource, or what actually helps protect it. So the caterpillar must either stay unnoticed, or it has to be able to dial down the ant's aggression. But how could it do that? Listen, maybe we can make a deal. In some species that live alongside ants, there are specialized glands and chemical signals that can tweak the ant's guard behavior. The caterpillar can release substances the ants interpret as harmless, and sometimes even as a food reward. It's not an alliance, it's a transaction. The larva gains access to insect colonies and a measure of safety, while the ants get an incentive not to attack it right away. That's why you don't see this everywhere. It's limited to certain narrow groups. And that's when I wondered, could they use a spider's web as a ready-made hunting net? If a web is the perfect trap, could they steal the catch from it as easily as ants steal aphids? Yeah, and it almost looks like a system hack. In Hawaii, scientists described a rare predatory caterpillar. It lives inside spider webs, hidden away in dark shelters, picks off insects stuck in the threads, and can even chew through the silk to reach its meal. To keep the spider from recognizing it, the caterpillar carries a portable silken house and decorates it with inedible bits of insects. So it's essentially disguised as trash and leftover scraps in the web. Weird Christmas trees they've got here. Okay, done. Now let's go find a Starbucks. Which raises an obvious question. Are there any caterpillars for which animal prey has become the main diet? The answer is yes. In North America, there's a well-known butterfly called Phanaseca tarquinius. Its larvae don't feed on leaves at all, but on colonies of aphids and related insects coated in wax. This isn't a supplement to the usual diet, it's a way of life. And here's why that matters for the bigger picture. Once a larva becomes a specialized predator, it no longer depends directly on a plant, but on whether living prey happens to be nearby. From there, the chain of dependencies inevitably becomes more complex. But that raises another question. If this species was plant-eating for tens of millions of years, where does a meat habit even come from in the first place? It's kind of like being the first person in your family to start therapy. Everyone thinks you're weird. The most likely first step isn't hunting, but a situation where animal food is already nearby and doesn't require any new skills. And in the world of caterpillars, the most available option is other larvae. Caterpillar cannibalism is a real thing, sometimes because they're crowded onto the same plant, sometimes because they're short on the right kind of food, and sometimes simply because a bigger larva can easily overpower a smaller one. And here's why that matters. Cannibalism provides concentrated protein without the complexity of hunting, and it can act as a bridge to the next step, eating any soft-bodied insects that happen to be within reach. It's an evolutionary test run of a new food source. And now for the key to the mystery of why they stopped turning into butterflies. If a caterpillar eats meat, that alone doesn't cancel pupation, so the cause has to be something in the mechanism that directly controls metamorphosis. And metamorphosis isn't a choice, it's a hormone-driven script. Until it starts, a larva can keep growing and molting, but it won't transition into a pupa. And then another player enters the scene, parasitoid wasps. They lay an egg inside a caterpillar, and after that, it's in their interest that the host doesn't pupate until the wasp larva has finished developing. So these parasites can interfere with the host's hormone system and delay the transition to the next stage. The result is that the caterpillar never transforms, they keep it stuck in larva mode. But why is stopping pupation so important to the parasite in the first place? Wouldn't a pupa be more convenient for them? It just hangs there in one spot, not moving. A pupa isn't sleep, it's a full-body reconstruction. The insect is essentially taken apart and then assembled again. The host's tissues, its hormones, its feeding program, its immune responses change, and all of that can destroy the conditions the parasite depends on. If the parasite is developing inside, stability is a huge advantage. It wants the host to stay alive in the familiar caterpillar format with predictable physiology and reliable resources. That's why many parasitoids keep the host at the caterpillar stage exactly as long as they need, and sometimes they even force it to molt at the wrong time or stay active. And here's the practical outcome. You see a larva that keeps living and eating for a long time, but the pupal stage never arrives. It looks like a nature glitching, but in reality, it's someone else's survival strategy. So how exactly do they hold a caterpillar in their larval stage if metamorphosis is triggered by hormones? To disrupt the switch into a pupa, they have to tamper with the signals that start molting and the body's reorganization. One of the main signals is ecdysone. Without a proper surge of this hormone, the larva to pupa molt won't begin. They say he's got parasites. Why would you think that? It's not a phase. It's my life now. And here's what the experiments show. In caterpillars infected by parasites, hormonal processes really can be disrupted, and sometimes an external dose of ecdysone partially restores their ability to move on to the next stage. So it isn't mysticism, and it isn't the genetics broke overnight, it's chemistry and physiology. The parasitoid, along with the compounds it releases, tweaks the host's internal settings so the host stays a convenient incubator. But it's important not to mix up cause and effect. If a caterpillar doesn't turn into a butterfly, it isn't always because of a parasite. The adult stage is retained when it's genuinely needed for flying, dispersing, and finding a mate, but some insect lineages solve those tasks differently, and then the adult form can become drastically simplified. Entomology even has a term for this, larva-form female, a female that is adult in function but still looks larva-like. This isn't a caterpillar that failed to become a butterfly, but a different life cycle strategy in which metamorphosis is partially reduced. And here's why that matters. Once the environment makes flight and long-range dispersal less advantageous, wings and a complex body become an unnecessary expense, and the adult form may simplify. I used to dream of becoming a butterfly so I could fly everywhere. And then a supermarket finally opened right next to my house. A pretty logical question follows, how can a female be an adult if she looks like a larva? In biology, adult isn't about having wings. It's about being able to reproduce. If the female doesn't need to fly around or search for food, it can actually benefit her not to spend resources on the complex body of a typical adult butterfly and instead invest those resources in eggs and staying protected in one place. And here's where this really happens. In some Psychidae species, females are often wingless and remain inside their little bag where they mate and lay eggs. The male, meanwhile, looks normal. He flies and goes out searching for the female. It's basically a division of labor. Dispersal and searching is the male's job, survival and producing offspring is the female's. If butterflies had parental leave, they'd probably split it 50-50 too. So this isn't a metamorphosis malfunction, it's a different kind of life cycle economy. But why does it get so extreme in bagworms and similar groups? Why does the female end up barely resembling a moth at all? The logic is simple. Every extra feature, wings, complex muscles, advanced sense organs, is a cost that doesn't necessarily provide a direct payoff. So in some species, females really are heavily reduced. They may be wingless, have simplified legs and weak vision, yet they're still adults functionally, and they still produce eggs. And here's what matters for the whole story arc. When the adult stage is reduced, the larval stage becomes the true center of the species' life, because that's where growth, feeding, and resource storage happen. Then any change in what the larva eats, including a switch to animal prey, stops being a weird footnote and becomes a central survival strategy. Then here's the next obvious question. Why does this getting stuck in an outwardly larva-like form happen more often in females than in males? Because the sexes usually have different jobs. A male almost always has to find a female, which means moving around, navigating, and competing. So wings and a normal adult form remain essential. For a female, the better strategy is often to survive, stay hidden, and channel as many resources as possible into eggs, especially if the breeding site is already found or basically guaranteed. And here's the consequence. If females barely disperse, populations become more tightly tied to local conditions, and local conditions are exactly what can push larvae toward unusual diets. For example, toward animal food when plant food is low quality or heavily defended. Then we still need to figure out how these two evolutionary threads tie together. Why does a caterpillar start eating meat, and why can the adult stage almost disappear? If most of a species' life happens in the larval stage, then the larva is the part that has to become as efficient as possible. It needs to stockpile building material for future reproduction fast, and animal food provides that material in a compact form. In systems like this, the adult stage more and more often turns into a short procedure, find a mate, and produce offspring without a long lifespan and without feeding. And here's where that leads. Once adulthood becomes short, any advantage in the larva's diet starts deciding the fate of the entire species, then meat isn't an exotic oddity. It's a way to save time and resources. But if it's so beneficial, why don't all caterpillars become predators and compress the adult stage? Because the adult butterfly has functions that the larva can't replace. The adult stage enables dispersal to new host plants, escape from local disasters, and mate finding across different patches of forest. Happy drowning, losers! Hey, how'd you do that? If you remove flight and long-distance movement, you save resources, but you lose flexibility. The population becomes tied to a single place and suffers more from droughts, fires, the loss of one plant species, or the collapse of a single aphid colony. That's the trade-off. Specialization only pays off where the environment is stable and the feeding spot is reliable. Everywhere else, being a generalist still wins. So what stops a larva from being predatory while still pupating normally? Specialization always comes with dependency. If a larva feeds on aphid or scale insect colonies, it has to end up in the right place at the right time. Otherwise, growth stalls. Imagine there's only one grocery store in your whole city, and it's open just a couple of hours a week. Miss your chance to shop, and that's it. Game over. Pupation demands both a decent energy reserve and perfect timing. Misread the season, and you die. For carnivorous predators, feeding windows can be shorter and more erratic than for herbivores because prey comes in waves and swings with the weather. So selection can push them to stay larva longer and wait for the moment instead of switching to a pupa on a fixed schedule. Metamorphosis doesn't disappear, it just becomes a much riskier bet in a bad year. Which raises a logical question. Why do many of these caterpillars go after tiny sapsuckers instead of proper larger insects? Think about it. Big prey means a fight and a real risk of injury, and a caterpillar simply isn't built for brawling. I'm made for pleasure. It's more advantageous for it to take what it can grab quickly and repeatedly. Colonies of aphids and scale insects are perfect for that. They cluster together, put up little resistance, and remain available for a long time as long as the plant stays alive. But here's the key point. Even if a caterpillar eats aphids, it still depends on plants indirectly. So what's the idea? The goal isn't to get away from plants, it's to change the form of the food. Leaves are bulky and full of fiber, while aphids are basically pre-processed plant sap turned into animal tissue. In other words, the nutrients pass through another insect as a kind of filter and become far more concentrated. Think of it like sipping from a muddy puddle versus grabbing purified water. The origin is the same, but the quality is much better. That's why this strategy can work even in places where there's plenty of greenery. So here's the next question. Why do meat-eating larvae depend so much on local conditions and not just on whether prey is present? The idea is that aphid and mealybug colonies stick around only where plants don't dry out or burn up in a matter of days. They need a stable microclimate, humidity, soft new shoots, and a predictable season. That's why these food chains often work best in habitats with steadier moisture, along the edges of ponds and streams, in damp thickets, and in spots with permanent vegetation. And here's what that leads to. A predatory larva becomes dependent not only on aphids being there, but on whether the colony can survive a heat wave, a downpour, or a sudden seasonal shift. For an herbivorous caterpillar, leaves are basically everywhere, but for a specialist that feeds on aphids, you need a specific patch where the whole system doesn't collapse. That's why the ranges of these species are often much more localized. And honestly, they're total gourmets. But there's another perceptual trap. Sometimes it looks like caterpillars have stopped pupating, when in reality, they just don't make it that far. The point is, if a larva lives in a riskier niche, you see pupae less often. Not because pupae don't exist, but because fewer individuals survive to reach that stage. And living near insect colonies and ants means constant run-ins with parasitoids, predators, and competitors. On top of that, a predatory diet requires contact with live prey, which always means more movement, more smells, and more signals that give the larva away. Basically, it's easier to notice a leopard sprinting around than a chill cow calmly chewing grass by a fence. Can you stop a caterpillar from pupating precisely without wrecking its whole body at once? Metamorphosis isn't triggered by a single lever. It's driven by a cascade of genes and hormonal signals. If a parasite needs time, it's better off shutting down one specific node in that cascade than killing the host. And modern research shows exactly that. In parasitized larvae, scientists find molecular mechanisms that suppress the activation of programs tied to the shift into the pupal stage, including regulation via small RNAs and changes in the activity of key developmental genes. The outcome looks the same. The caterpillar keeps eating and growing, but the threshold for metamorphosis never arrives. It's targeted biochemistry that holds the host in a convenient phase. But why is it even possible to push metamorphosis around this much if it's a fundamental butterfly mechanism? Is metamorphosis really launched by a single click? Not quite. Metamorphosis isn't a button, it's a chain of checkpoints. The larva has to reach a critical body mass and receive the right environmental signals, otherwise pupation won't start. Have you ever had a medical checkup before starting a new job? It's basically the same idea here. That's why the timing can shift so dramatically. The thresholds change and the regulatory system's sensitivity changes with them. So what's more dangerous for a species in the long run, switching to meat or reducing the adult stage almost down to zero? Meat changes the diet, but it keeps the main safety net, adult dispersal. Evolution here is always a trade-off. You gain efficiency in one spot, but you lose long-distance resilience. That's exactly why these strategies don't become universal across all butterflies. They work as narrow solutions for specific conditions, not as a new standard. Well, the cabbage is gone. Fine. I'll have about 1 pound of Steve. In the end, these are two different risks. A meat-based diet makes you dependent on whether prey will be nearby, while a shortened adult stage makes you dependent on how stable one particular place is, because dispersal is almost impossible. And when both risks stack, the species becomes especially reliant on the stability of its world. So what, will we start seeing these strategies more often? Are we heading for a world without butterflies? For the adult stage to be drastically reduced, the environment has to be stable and reproduction has to work without long-range flights. For a larva to survive on meat, prey has to be regularly available and the risks have to pay off. We're not heading toward a planet without butterflies. What we're seeing is evolution occasionally reshuffling what each life stage is for under specific conditions. In some cases, the larva becomes the center of life, and the adult phase turns into a short, technical formality. In other cases, a parasite temporarily blocks metamorphosis to match its own life cycle. Somewhere else, the diet shifts toward aphids because it's a faster way to pack in protein. This isn't the end of metamorphosis. It's proof that metamorphosis is a tool nature can adjust. And if you look closely, it becomes clear. The strangest caterpillars aren't exceptions to the rules. They're clues to how flexible the rules can become when the cost of time and resources changes. You owe me a like. See you later.